So this is the European Enlightenment, where today, folks, what we're going to be looking at is the basic idea of what the American founders were influenced by here in the United States. Basically, this happened during a time period which is known as the Enlightenment. We've got a couple of different videos and a few other activities that we're going to go through to basically go through together and figure out what may be happening, at least at this particular point, at different times and different places that kind of influence the United States of America going forward. So that's the main goal today, is to go back and look at some of the people that the founding fathers took from through a couple of different activities as well. So the big thing here, guys, is this key term right here, the Age of Enlightenment, and how it would basically be discussed and what would basically happen, and the different parts that would basically go into creating the new idea of government in the future United States of America, originally known as the American colonies. So the whole basic idea, guys, of this Enlightenment is this idea of more freedom. For a lot of different people, they got very tired of the old feudalism and kings, queens, dictators, that kind of stuff. So the question then became, how much freedom is too much freedom? And that's where you guys can kind of look at this. Would you want to live in a place with complete freedom, no rules, and no government? All right, most people might say yes, but there's a lot of different pieces to this, all right, that we're going to look at. So the Age of Enlightenment was around the 18th century, the 1700s, where a lot of different things happened after the plague, and different kind of diseases kind of came and went, where you started to see this idea of what does it mean to actually live, what does it mean to have basic rights, and then what is the purpose of the overall government. So again, the way of government basically was being changed, and the thought process behind it had to be adjusted and basically fixed to look at new ways of thinking. So this is kind of the first part, where just kind of break down what this was and what happens. So a couple of key things to basically remember here. The Age of Enlightenment started around 1715, came out of Europe. It was mainly gathered in major cities like Paris, London, Barcelona, different places like that, where you started to see it become known as the Age of Reason. Why was it becoming the Age of Reason? Because most places created this idea that most people in a society have these things called life, liberty, and property. That is most commonly associated with one of our founding kind of influencers, would be John Locke and his major ideas. So most people basically said, hey, it's not enough just to live. We need life, liberty, and property, at least at this particular point in time, to basically go through. So the idea then became is, if we're allowed life, liberty, and property, should we be allowed freedom to basically express what we mean it is to live, what we think is liberty, and basically to have property. So it became this idea of there may not necessarily be a need for government. People would live in this idea of a state of nature with no rules, complete freedom, and they basically say it's a social contract that everybody's going to give up some freedom, all right, basically, and in exchange, people will get life, liberty, and property. You would give up some of the crazier basic freedoms like robbing, killing, different kinds of things that would happen to basically say, hey, if we all agree to kind of get along, this is where stuff basically goes through. So this idea of creating a government where people all get along and people aren't basically being ruled by one person or one family becomes known as this term called consent of the governed. Basically, the idea of no laws or new things could happen unless the citizens or people would agree to this. So this is what it means to be having the consent of the governed. It is the idea of a government to protect its citizens, but the government also had absolute power, because the kings were basically telling everybody what to do, so were the queens and other people as well. This is a new way of thinking, where it's not the person in charge that tells people what to do. It is the people that tell the person in charge what to do and everything else that happens. So this basically had an idea where kings, European leaders, were all about heredity or family members, and making sure that they all go back in their family histories and everything else. So many people during the Enlightenment believed that this idea of republicanism should basically come into effect, where you start to see this idea of, okay, we can't have everybody involved at the exact same time, but what if we create this idea of a republic, which basically looked at this idea of, okay, the idea of a republic basically means people get representation. They don't get to directly say what's right or wrong, but they're going to have somebody represent them. A lot of people during this time period think that democracy and some other stuff was born. Not necessarily, because a lot of people that were coming up with these ideas wanted representation. They wanted educated people because they didn't want uneducated people to have the power to vote. During this time, you had Rousseau, Montesquieu, and John Locke, as I mentioned earlier, became very famous. These would be three people that would basically develop all of the ideas that would be founded in what we would eventually, most people consider the end of the Age of Enlightenment, 1789. So it goes from 1715 all the way down, right, till 1789, when this basically began in a lot of different ways and created these ideas of new government. So this next assignment, this is where you guys can basically shade in the different areas that you basically look at. So again, if it's 1715 all the way to about 1789, you're looking at somewhere around there. So during that time, you start to see Benjamin Franklin, the Boston Tea Party, other areas basically pop up between that 60 to 70 year period that is known as the Age of Enlightenment. So then you start to see all these different kinds of things that happen with this, and there's a little video here. It's kind of like a video game that basically explains this idea of the state of nature and social contract. The main idea, guys, behind this, okay, in the state of nature, okay, it's what comes natural to folks. All right, and then the idea of social contract is what is best for the group or society overall. So sometimes these two things don't coincide. Some people just have a natural tendency to want to do a lot of different things that other people may not necessarily agree with at the exact same time. So this is where you start to see, all right, this main idea of, okay, we're going to let people do what they want. We're going to allow life, liberty, okay, and property to basically go through, but we also understand there has to be some sort, all right, of restrictions at the exact same time. There have to be some set of limits in place for people to basically have a truly successful new society. So now you've got a little short assignment here where you've talked about this idea, period of time that had new ideas about human existence. So you could start to see all this idea of enlightenment, so human existence, and also human consent or other things as well. So you're just basically filling this in with some of the big ideas that go into this and just filling it in and looking at all the other major topics that we talked about earlier. And this next one, if you were going to draw, what it basically meant is, okay, how was government before Enlightenment? You might draw a crown, a lot of kings and queens and everything else. How Enlightenment thinkers believed government should work. You basically could have a bunch of people equal one person, where people think it should be about representation. It should be about the consent of the governed. It shouldn't be about one person ruling everything. It should be about everybody having their share and their say in how their country is going to be ran. So how did the Enlightenment influence our founding fathers? Well, a lot of different ideas basically came about with that. You started to see these ideas of representation, for one, would probably be the first thing that a lot of people would say came out of this. You also started to see this idea of natural rights, which would lead into something called the Bill of Rights as well, that would be founded here for the United States government. All right. You also start to see this idea of what does it mean to have, okay, liberty and freedom at the exact same point. So there's a lot of different things that kind of came out of that, and that's just some stuff in a nutshell that you might kind of want to go back and look at before we jump into this. So with this, the Constitution recognized that citizens were born with basic rights. Again, there's where the Bill of Rights and stuff will come into play. Even though some of the Founding Fathers agreed with the concern about democracy. Remember, all right, originally here for most of these thinkers, it was not about democracy. All right, democracy was not the idea. It was about a republic. That was the big concern. Main reason, all right, the idea of uneducated votes. If you have a true democracy, everybody gets one equal vote. Some people felt that the uneducated that didn't know what was going on in the world because we didn't have the technology as we do now, that they wouldn't have the proper way to basically pick what was right for the entire country. So what you start to see here as far as all this stuff, how did the Age of Enlightenment change thinking about government? All right, biggest one is power from people, not kings or queens. That's probably the biggest idea. And again, another one is the idea of rights, and more rights that you get to being as a person. All right, what did it basically create? All these things, and how did it influence the Founding Father? It created the structure for the U.S. Constitution. And you started to see a lot of different things that would come out of that document. So again, guys, the biggest thing that came out of the European Enlightenment during this time period, and a lot of different things that were going on, again, is natural rights, representative government, people like John Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, who all basically said people have natural rights, people basically should have representation, and a lot of different ideas that came about. So this was some of the founding ideas that the United States of America basically took to create its new country and its new way of doing things. This is where we get our ideas, and it was again called the European Enlightenment as we now know it.